So, I just finished my PhD in New Testament. And as part of my PhD, my dissertation was a focus on civil unrest in the ancient world and how that influences our understanding of civil unrest in the New Testament. Now, specifically, I focused on government responses to civil unrest. So I did a study of how the ancient Roman government, specifically in the early empire, dealt with civil unrest, crowd protest, mob violence, riots, and then how that influences our understanding of passages in the New Testament that deal with civil unrest. And this is a topic focused on the ancient world, right? So you wouldn't expect it to be all that relevant today. But then you look at the news. And what you immediately see as you look at the news is that there's all kinds of riots and government responses to riots and all these. There's protests and government responses to protests. And all of a sudden, the things that I've studied in my dissertation have become relevant. And what's interesting is, as part of my study, I didn't just study civil unrest in Rome and in the New Testament. I also studied civil unrest today. How do modern governments respond to civil unrest? So, as I think through what's happening in our country here in June of 2020, with all of the public protests and riots and public outcry, I think some of the things that I learned while working on my dissertation can help you to understand what's going on a little bit more. So as you watch the news, as you hear about these things, I want to help you to understand what's happening a little bit more. So the first thing I want you to understand or see is that police knowledge influences police action. And what I mean by that is how the police interpret and understand a particular situation is going to influence how they respond to a particular situation. So you, as individuals, deal with this. When you get up in the morning, you're faced with 1,000 different decisions that you have to make. And when you make these decisions, you usually make these decisions based on the things that have influenced you. A lifetime of experience, your likes and dislikes, the amount of time that you have, the things that other people have said, the kind of world that we live in. These things influence how you respond to a particular encounter or event. So that same thing is true with the police. So the police, their knowledge or their perception of an event is going to influence how they react. It's going to influence their actions. So, for example, the media and the things that the media is saying, whether that be positive towards crowds or negative towards crowds, or positive towards a particular ethnic, cultural, or racial group, or negative towards a particular culture, ethnic, racial, socioeconomic group. That's going to influence the police's perception of that group. Also, politics. What's the political rhetoric right now? Is the political rhetoric like you need to be tough on crime, you need to be tough on these protesters, or is the political rhetoric we need to give them a big berth, or we need to a wide berth, or allow them to kind of move? That political rhetoric, both in local politics, state politics, and national politics, will influence the police force and how they respond when they're faced with a crowd. Other things, public opinion. How is the public going to look at us if we respond this way or that way? Police culture. Do we have a culture in our police force that look at that crowd that I'm faced with as the enemy or as people who we are friendly to? That's going to influence how I interact with them. What are our institutional procedures or policies? If we have an institutional procedure or policy that says you use every possible way to avoid the use of force, then that's going to influence you in one direction. But if you have an institutional policy where our focus is, it's all about the use of force, or it's all about a more militarized focus, then that's going to influence your response. And there's a whole bunch of other things: public policy, the personal prejudice of a particular individual, the crowd's behavior. Is the crowd threatening or not threatening? And the threat to public order. Is the crowd looking like they're going to hurt others or damage property? These things all influence police officers and riot control police. Now, you've got to understand that when we are looking at these kinds of situations. Now, understand, I'm trying to be careful not to favor any particular side on this. But what I want you to understand is that all of these things influence whether or not a police force chooses to use a certain strategy for countering a crowd. So, as you study ancient Rome, most people think of ancient Rome as stab first and ask questions later. But that's actually not what you see when you study civil unrest in the 1st century AD. What you actually see is that Rome kind of had this policy of, man, if we just go in and start attacking people with the army, there's going to be a lot of people that die, and there's probably going to be some property damage. So what we'd rather do is we'd rather persuade people to step down. So that was their police culture. Their culture was, look, we've got to let them say their piece, and we'll try to persuade them to calm down, and we will use force as a last resort. So even in the ancient world, these are concepts that you see in the ancient world, you see in the modern world, where a police force has to say, when we face this crowd, are we going to use force or are we not going to use force? And the way the Romans dealt with it is they said, we're going to avoid using force if at all possible. Now, there are plenty of examples of them using force, but usually they try to persuade people to stand down or to calm down first. So, as we look at that in our modern context, when you're watching the news, you need to ask yourselves, okay, what kind of things influenced this police force to do this? Because some police forces are responding to crowds by giving the crowds a lot of leeway, and there's a lot of damage being done. And other police forces are cracking down heavily, and a lot of protesters are getting injured and hurt and killed in some cases. So I'm not telling you what to think. I'm telling you to think for yourself and say, okay, why did this happen over here, and why did this happen over here? What things influence the police's knowledge of the situation to make them take this step or that step? And that way, when we're creating public policy and we're trying to influence the police department, maybe the police department is being too violent, or maybe the police department's not valuing personal property. Okay, there are some tweaks we can do to public policy when we talk to our representatives. The next thing that I think we learn here that's really helpful is that riot policing should balance public expression with personal safety. Public expression with personal safety. Okay, so, with public safety. So they should balance public expression with public safety. So, and another thing, we see this in ancient Rome. Most people realize that ancient Rome, specifically Imperial Rome, was not a bastion of democracy. But what the Romans really realized was that we have to allow crowds to be able to speak up and to be able to say and to express discontent. We can't just let it boil over. At the same time, they would only let it go so far. So we've got to understand that there is this balancing act that we as a society, and specifically those doing riot policing, have to do. They need to, and we have a democratic society, unlike the Romans that did not. There's this balance. You have to allow people to protest publicly. Otherwise, you're going to end up having some major catastrophic issues on your hands. And you see this in years ago with the Arab Spring, where you had this major political suppression until everything just blew up. Yeah, so you need to have the opportunity for people to express public expression. But also, you need to regulate public safety. So you need to make sure that people's property and people's lives are being taken care of and protected while people are having public expression. So these things should really influence what we do when we talk about riot policing and police culture. So when you look at a thing about the police using force on a crowd, you need to ask yourself questions like, okay, why did they do this? Is this an issue of a peaceful crowd with a police force that has a culture and an institutional dynamic that sees the crowd as an enemy? Or is this a case of a police force that's doing their best to maintain control, but a crowd that got rowdy and affected them and forced them to take steps? We've got to weigh these things and look at them. Don't just listen to a soundbite. Do your research and try to understand, okay, what things maybe influenced this encounter and influence this police force to take these actions or this crowd to take these actions. So that way we can have a robust look at what's going on in our country. There are some significant issues that need to be addressed in our country. And we have a country where you can have that kind of public protest and that public expression. So when we see these clashes between the government and between the people on the streets, we need to ask ourselves, okay, what's influencing this? What's influencing the police maybe to be too lenient or the police maybe to be too harsh? What's influencing those? And I think these two things, the fact that police knowledge influences police action, let's think what things are influencing our police and what things do we need to change. And the other thing is riot policing should balance public expression with public security. Okay, how were they trying to balance that? Or were they just kind of favoring one over the other? So I think these two ideas help us to kind of get a grasp on what's going on when we hear about these riot control situations. I studied a lot more on this, but I think these two things can kind of help us to understand what's going on a little bit more. And I hope it's been helpful to you. Thanks.